Welcome to the Day in History for April 20th. Okay, here we go. Today's Day in History is the day the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig explodes in the Gulf of Mexico, beginning an oil spill that would last 6 months. Now, the big idea for today is that some mistakes can have very, very serious consequences. Now, this happened in 2010, which was when I worked for the government. And part of my job when I worked for the government was to pay attention to the news to see what was happening. And we actually had a TV in my office that had news on like the entire day. And I remember this disaster very, very clearly because it was on the news non-stop. It was a huge, huge disaster. So much oil got spilled. It's crazy. So I'll let you write this down. Okay, here we go. So we are in the Gulf of Mexico. And the drilling actually took place about 41 miles off the coast of Louisiana. Now, let's talk about oil. Now, we already talked about oil a little bit when we did the Alaskan pipeline. We talked about its uses. We talked a little bit about how we get it out of the ground. But oil is a huge part of our daily life in the society that we live in. It is what I would consider a fundamental human need at this point. It powers our cars, it powers a lot of our electrical plants. It is a huge part of our society. And so we need a lot of it. And companies realized this and they started supplying it. And we go through so much oil that we have to constantly get new sources of oil. And that's kind of what today's Day in History is about. Now, when we say drill for oil, this is often what we think of. These are the drilling platforms that are, or not platforms, these are the drilling sites that are on land. They're kind of an iconic image of what drilling for oil looks like. Now, these work by drilling holes or wells down into the ground until you get to the source of the oil. And now, when you get to that source of the oil, because there's so much weight pushing down on that liquid, when you finally drill into it, the pressure is huge, and that oil wants to shoot up out of that well. And so part of the job of these oil platforms on land is to contain the oil and then pump it out in a slower fashion. And so the oil platforms on land are a lot more manageable because, well, they're on land. You can walk up to them. It's a lot easier to get machines up to them. And so that's what we primarily used until fairly recently. Now, last time I checked, the Earth is 75% water, or thereabouts. Now, what that means is that there is so much more possible oil under the ocean because the continents used to move around. Well, they're still moving, right? Now, the continents, as they move, they used to be land, now they're water, etc. And so a lot of oil is trapped under the surface of the ocean. And so companies realize that if they can get a well to those locations, there's a ton of oil they can get at. And they figured out how to do that. They built these platforms that would either be connected to the ground, like in this picture with these big legs, or would actually float, and then they would drill down and pump the oil out. It worked pretty good. Now, the company that ran the Deepwater Horizon oil rig is called Transocean, and they have a huge number of platforms that drill for oil in the ocean. Now, if you look at the map here, you can see how there's little locations of where they drill. And so they actually own the oil rig, and then BP, or British Petroleum, is the company that leased it. Now, BP is the 6th largest oil company in the world, and that's saying a lot because oil companies are huge. They make a ton of money. Now, BP leased this rig, and they were actually getting the oil that came from it. Now, the location of where this took place was pretty close to the coast off Louisiana, and there's a lot of oil deposits there, and they're a little bit easier to get to because it's not too deep. It was about 5,000 feet deep where the Deepwater Horizon was parked. Now, this is what it looked like. This was one of the floating platforms. It cost about $560 million to make, and 126 people worked on it. And the well that it drilled, it actually drilled down 35,000 feet underground. Pretty deep. A lot of pressure pushing on that oil down there. Now, this is an iconic image of the Deepwater Horizon exploding. And pretty much what happened was the cement at the base of the well failed. And all of a sudden, all of the pressure shot up, and it shot all the way up into the well, causing explosions and eventually fire, and then a complete catastrophe. Now, 11 people did die in this disaster, and the rig ended up sinking. And this was all covered live on TV. It was a pretty impactful moment. It's something that I still remember today. Now, it sank, but the oil kept coming. Now, what is supposed to happen, there's supposed to be something called a blowout preventer. And if you look at this picture, you see these little arrows that are going like this? What's supposed to happen is that if there's a problem, they're supposed to have these little things go and close the well. There's a bunch of them so that they can all close to stop the oil from coming out. Because the companies that did this job knew that the possibility of a huge oil spill was possible. And so they were supposed to have what they would call fail safes, or they were supposed to have a way to stop the problem. It didn't work. Now, this image is oil getting pumped into the ocean. It's just getting pumped in. Now, if you've ever looked at oil, like crude, nasty oil, this stuff is horrible stuff, and it doesn't mix with water. Usually, if you have like a solution, they'll mix together and it'll just make like oily water. But this stuff just flows in and sticks to anything. It's absolutely horrible stuff. Now, they tried a couple different ways to stop it. At first, they put down oil dispersants, which is actually a chemical that makes the oil break up into smaller pieces so it doesn't stick to things quite as bad. That helped a little bit, but it also just spread out the oil even farther. They drilled relief wells. So they drilled new wells on the side to kind of take some of the pressure off so not as much came out the broken part. And this did help, but still, oil was getting pumped in every single minute. Now, they also built this giant cap. Imagine just like a giant thing just being plopped right on top of the oil well to try and stop it. This totally failed, didn't work, and so they tried again. They eventually got a smaller cap to fit right on top that they were able to pump some of the oil out of to help get some of it to quit spilling into the water. Now, this went on for months. This oil spill went on for months, and eventually they got it under control, but the spill was huge. Now, they spilled a ton of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. In total, they estimate 168 million gallons of oil was just pumped straight into the water. I'm not going to show you all the pictures of how much it hurt the wildlife or the ecosystem or the fish or the shores or how it's still found all over this area today, but it has had a dramatic effect on the wildlife and on people's jobs there, because there's a lot of people that depended on the wildlife and the fishing and the shrimp for a living. So it was a pretty big deal. I thought this picture was pretty interesting. It shows you just how the oil comes up to the surface and it just sits there. And this last picture is a satellite image of the oil coming out of the actual drill. Now, we did learn a lot of lessons from this. We have to be very careful with the resources that we get out of the ground. And the Deepwater Horizon was a disaster that taught us a lot of lessons. And we just need to make sure that we don't do it again. Okay, thanks guys. See you tomorrow.